Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Vamos a dar inicio a esta primera mesa redonda de la Escuela de Verano, donde vamos a tener como participantes principales a Atocha, Aliseda, ¿no?, de quien ahorita haré una pequeña semblanza, a Juan González, que también ahorita diré algunas palabras, y de Kelso, que yo creo que ya no necesita una presentación adicional a la que hizo Matthew, ¿no? Y antes de empezar con esta mesa redonda que tiene como título ¿qué son las ciencias cognitivas?, que he de decir, cuando platicaba con Marisa Carrasco, que me preguntaba qué tan profundo, qué tan técnico, qué tan específico podría ser la escuela de verano, dije que íbamos a tratar de abarcar desde cosas generales, que yo supongo se van a hacer profundas muy rápidamente, iniciando con esta mesa redonda que son las ciencias cognitivas. Atocha Aliseda, licenciada en Matemáticas por la Facultad de Psicología y por la Facultad de Ciencias en la UNAM, y doctora en Filosofía y Sistemas Simbólicos por el Departamento de la Filosofía de la Universidad de Stanford. Ha sido profesora visitante en el Institute for Logic, Language and Computation de la Universidad de Ámsterdam y del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Groningen en Holanda, así como en el Departamento de Filosofía y Lógica y Filosofía de las Ciencias de la Universidad de Sevilla. Ha estado también en el Centro Universitario de Ciencias en la Salud de la Universidad de Guadalajara, y entiendo que ahorita es uno de sus intereses principales, la filosofía de las ciencias de la salud. Es investigadora de tiempo completo, titular C en la UNAM, en el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, investigadora nacional en el Sistema Nacional nivel 3. Ha publicado y compilado libros y artículos sobre lógica y filosofía de la ciencia. Sus temas de investigación son el razonamiento abductivo y las lógicas del descubrimiento científico, ¿no? Trabaja actualmente en temas de causalidad y razonamiento clínico. Doctor Juan González, profesor e investigador de tiempo completo en Filosofía y Ciencias Cognitivas en la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Morelos desde 1999. Pertenece al Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, es nivel 2, y es cofundador de la Facultad de Humanidades del Departamento de Filosofía, del posgrado en Filosofía Contemporánea, del posgrado en Ciencias Cognitivas y del Centro de Investigación en Ciencias Cognitivas, el CINCO de la UAEM, ¿no? Fundador de Instituciones. Doctor en Ciencias Cognitivas y Filosofía por la École Polytechnique de Francia, y se tituló con la tesis La constitución del espacio visual, investigación epistemológica en torno a un sistema de sustitución sensorial, bajo la dirección de los doctores Francisco Varela y Jean Petitot. Tiene una maestría en filosofía por la Universidad de París, la Sorbonne, bajo la dirección de Jacques Bouveres. Sus áreas de interés y de trabajo son epistemología, ciencias cognitivas, filosofía de la mente y de la percepción. Su acercamiento a la cognición es tripartita a través de la investigación empírica, el análisis conceptual y la fenomenología. Bienvenidos a los dos, y Scott Kelso, welcome to this round table. Entonces, empezaremos, si les parece, yo les haría una pregunta muy general para que cada uno pudiera exponer en 10 minutos primeras reacciones, primeras ideas, y a partir de ahí ya vemos si vamos dando respuestas, si vamos coordinando, ¿no?, las propias, a partir de las respuestas que den, la dinámica de esta mesa redonda. Si nos llegamos a tener alguna pausa larga, pues les haré yo otras preguntas, pero básicamente ustedes son los actores principales. Entonces, lo primero que quisiera preguntarles, ¿no?, pensando puntualizando 10 minutos de una primera intervención para luego tener estas reacciones, y luego intercalaremos, si les parece, preguntas del público. La primera pregunta que les quiero hacer para iniciar es si debemos pensar en una ciencia cognitiva o en ciencias cognitivas. ¿Quién quiere empezar? I'll ask a first very general question. Should we talk about cognitive science, a unified cognitive science, or should we talk about cognitive sciences in the plural?
Maybe there should be one science. Maybe there should just be one science, and that science would embrace human beings and cognition, and that would embrace the many disciplines that have got us to where we are at the present time. So that would be one response that I would have, that cognitive science itself is a multidisciplinary adventure. I would say also one should not ignore the social sciences in this respect, because we're social creatures most of the time, as Bob Dylan said, you know, most of the time. So I think that's emerging as a field on its own as well, social science, social cognition. So if one looks at the history of cognitive science, you see that some of the main players, at least in the United States and the Western world kind of thing, were coming from a background of experimental psychology. And then that grew into cognitive psychology. And then in the 60s with the classical books of Miller, Galanter, Pribram, George Miller. So you brought in linguistics, computer science in particular, anthropology as well. So it then became, you know, those are multiple sciences themselves, but became then under one rubric, which was cognitive neuroscience. And as I mentioned in my talk, then we've moved on now to cognitive neuroscience. So I think cognitive science is enough in the realization that it already is a multidisciplinary activity.
First of all, I would like to add something to the history of the cognitive science. Okay? Yes? Here. Okay. So first of all, I would like to add something to the history that Professor Kelso already mentioned. Actually, the term cognitive science appeared until 1975 with two books explicitly mentioning cognitive science. However, I would say that cognitive science as the study of the mind actually started with philosophy. So it is us philosophers who really created the cognitive science, then the psychologists came, and then everyone else, of course, including the neuroscientists. However, now, if the singular or the plural, is it best to talk about cognitive science, the cognitive science or the cognitive sciences? Actually, I am borrowing a claim from a cognitive scientist, which I'm afraid I don't remember his name, but this person at the Association of Cognitive Science back in, I think it was 2004 in Chicago, he was claiming that there is really no cognitive science, but cognitive scientists. So it is the specific academic scientist who is interested in a specific problem, the one who has to draw from different diverse number of disciplines to work on a specific problem. So I think it's a very pertinent question, but of course we don't want to get into any terminological problems. What's important is that, we promote the study of cognition from very diverse fields. This is what I would say as an answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Juan, por favor.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the initiative of this summer school. I think it's a great initiative, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers and to UNAM. Well, I think the question is really more than terminological as far as I'm concerned. I think cognitive science in the Anglo world reflects some kind of old ambition that probably comes or goes back to the to logical positivism. You know, we know that Carnap, for instance, insisted on the unity of science, and at the same time in the continental world, you know, especially France, you know, where I studied myself, I was taught that the name should be cognitive sciences, and the reason for that is I think a word of caution. That is to say, there is no, as far as I'm concerned, and I think it can be argued that there is really no common ground in terms of methodology, you know, conceptual basis, or even perhaps history, you know, of the discipline itself. So I think it's more cautious to say that we do cognitive sciences, but trying to aim at that unity, you know, perhaps as an ideal, you know, that we'll never reach. But I think it's somehow more prudent or cautious just to say cognitive science, you know, trying to translate also a will to work together in these different disciplines. So it's like a reminder, you know, that we're not really there yet, and that we need to keep on working, and we need the attitude for that, not only the knowledge.
So you're not reifying cognitive science, as you would say, but exposing
the state of the art, basically, as it is now, you know.
So you mentioned France. I always remember les sciences humaines. So what is the difference then between les sciences humaines and cognitive sciences?
I think it's similar. Basically, the problem is similar, you know, except that in cognitive science, in the cognitive sciences, you know, we study a common object, you know, which is cognition or mind, overall speaking, you know, and the humanities, you know, or the les sciences humaines have different objects.
And it's not, I would say, maybe you would disagree, but it's not restricted to human beings. It's restricted to knowing creatures at all levels. Yeah,
of course, including robots, perhaps.
Yeah, this is precisely where I wanted to get in. If we use the term human, of course, humans are the ones who produce robots and all that. But I wouldn't like to call them human sciences only because I think we're talking in general about symbolic systems. If these are human or automatic or even animals, now there's a lot of literature on that. I would rather talk about symbolic systems in general.
Well, let me read one little piece of person that everyone would consider, if there was a cognitive revolution, one of the fathers of that cognitive revolution. George Miller said in 2003, "The original dream of a unified science that would discover the representational and computational capacities of the human mind and their structural and functional realization in the human brain still has an appeal that I cannot resist." And before that sentence, he says that he himself would prefer to speak of the cognitive sciences. What do you think about that paragraph? And I would like to set it up against what you said in your previous talk. Do we have, and what you mentioned a lot in your book, dynamic patterns. Do we really need, is cognitive science revolving around symbols? Do symbols exist?
Well, this doesn't want to come away. Here, that's better. this raises, I think, a lot of interesting questions because, of course, Miller-Galanter Pribram, you know, the 1960 book, Plans and the Organization of Behavior, or Plans and the Structure of Behavior. Indeed, thank you. This was also thought of as a precursor of cognitive psychology, cognitive science. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that it matters whether it's one or the other. I recognize the reification issue. We should be cautious about that. I think we're all kind of agreed about that. Now, to say that cognitive science's sole focus is on symbols, I think also restricts us because, as you probably know, there was quite a lot of development, say in the case of connectionism, neural networks, dynamical systems where the dynamical, that is to say, the time-dependent aspects of cognition became recognized much more than they had previously. So for me, this is a really fundamental issue, that is to say, the relation between the symbolic and the dynamic. So symbols, just for our fellow seekers here, symbols are typically timeless, they're symbolic, they're time independent. So now the question is, how do you reconcile symbols with something that's time dependent, dynamics? And that is, I think, a very basic issue that perhaps you'd like to...
Yeah, well, thank you. When we speak about cognition, science of cognition or sciences of cognition, I also think this terminology in the, when all this started, let me put it, we're in the 1950s of the last century. Of course, as Professor Kelso suggested, the representationist paradigm was there. So we, well, I was not there, but people spoke about symbols. After that, well, symbols were not so important in any more, but I guess still we speak of, if you want to call it, information processing. No, perhaps that's a more general point. However, what I also wanted to say about what we meant or the field as cognition has changed a lot. Now we can speak of embodied cognition, whereas before, cognition was just for things having to do with the rational. So if we were asked, let's say 40 years ago, what is cognition? I don't think many people would talk about cognition as, now let me put my philosopher's hat, as the pragmatists talked about cognition. Let me just cite here Charles Peirce. He had this idea of cognition as something that went from perception to creativity. So there was cognition in perception, but there was also, of course, cognition in issues having to do with scientific discovery, creativity, and so on. As you to some extent, I think we don't have like the right words for all the concepts we need when we're speaking about these issues. But still, that's why I think for this particular event was so important to have a first roundtable trying to characterize what are we talking about when we talk about the cognitive sciences or the cognitive science or the cognitive scientist, as I wanted to suggest.
Thank you. I think we may acknowledge George Miller as one of the founding fathers of cognitivism, this paradigm, you know, that still has a good grip on cognitive science nowadays, but much less than used to be. And I think we can sort of learn to coexist, you know, and take the best out of the 2 or 3 worlds or 4 worlds, you know, We have now new paradigms, as Professor Aliseda mentioned. You know, we have the inactive embodied paradigm, the connectionist, as Professor Kelso mentioned. Now we have the 4E, you know, here that Professor Frost is developing, you know, and of course cognitivism or computationalism is still alive and kicking, and why not, you know? Like my own motto, you know, is take the best, you know, of what you need in order to do what your own thing, you know. So I don't think really there is a problem, you know, to consider that cognitivism is there, and that cognitive science or the cognitive sciences are developing, but we need discipline and we need a method. That's for sure, and I think that's really something wanting still.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Please. No, go ahead.
Just on the methods aspect, the methods, of course, in terms of the early days, where things like reaction times and in response to various kinds of stimuli and stage analyses of reaction times, decision making, these were dominant paradigms. The thing is that there was a lot going on to produce a reaction time. Even if you think that that kind of stimulus-response relationship was important to characterize. So I think with the methods that are being developed, really giving us more time-dependent measures, continuous measures, for example, rather than a discrete measure like reaction time, or is a big step forward, and that's occurring, of course, in the neurosciences, big time. So I think the path, it seems these days, and maybe it's temporary, but the path seems to be from cognitive science to cognitive neuroscience. And the modern methods are strongly dominant. And I would maybe mention one other thing, that of course the computationalist, representationalist approach was countered strongly by James Gibson and direct realists. And a lot of very clever work has and is being done to recognize what information processing really is. What is information for the normal guidance of behavior? These are really important inclusions, yeah, in the whole enterprise. Yeah.
I just wanted to react to that. Actually, yeah, ecological psychology for sure, evolutionary psychology, and neurobiology. You know, so I mean, several disciplines that point at the study of cognition, not only in time in ontogenetic levels, but also phylogenetic, you know, across our natural history, and then of course in terms of the relationship we have with the environment. I think those are two things that have been left out, you know, for instance, by computationalism traditionally. And as regard to what you're saying, becoming like cognitive neuroscience, you know, I mean, as much as I like cognitive neuroscience, you know, I think that still, it seems to me, sounds to me, still very neurocentric. And I think we definitely need to go, and we have now new techniques in order to study, you know, investigate the brain and the nervous system, but that is only part of the picture. And very important as it is, I think we should not forget that it's only one part of it.
You mentioned at the beginning that there was one problem that cognitive science or cognitive sciences are addressing, and that would be cognition. But then you mentioned cognition could be or spans a lot of different phenomena, from perception to creativity and whatever have you. So what's the problem of cognition? Cognition seems to be like a block that everyone can chop in different ways. The original cognitive sciences at least when it was proclaimed that it was a big revolution that had occurred, and several authors characterized it as the convergence of psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, computational science, and neuroscience. Six different disciplines, at least at the beginning. And it seems like at least 4 of those 6 disciplines have a different object, I will simplify it. Linguistics, it's very clear, it's language in all its different aspects. Language and speech, of course, and George Miller would say that immediately. And anthropology, belief systems, culture, psychology, whatever mechanisms we have to reason, to pay attention, to memorize. And the other 2 at the time would, if we look back, probably were just providing methods or different methodological approaches to cognition, algorithms, computation as a way to analyze whatever all those other 4 disciplines were trying to understand. And neuroscience, of course, we wanted to find the seat of the soul. And so is it just one problem, or is it different problems? Is it just representation and computation, just cognition, or where's the dynamics, where's action? Can we study it in the abstract, or as you already mentioned, we need the organism, we need to embody it, the embodiment of cognition. So can we give the audience some examples of what it would mean to really dissect the term cognition? I know it's a diffuse question, so you can.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I will answer your question so directly, but through a particular example. I think if we think of somebody like Noam Chomsky, could we consider him a cognitive scientist when he was studying language acquisition? Well, he was mainly a linguist. His question came from linguistics. However, what methods did he use? Well, he, I'm sure, inspired by automata theory and Alan Turing, he devised a model based on automata theory to propose how is that universal grammar can be represented. But that had a direct consequence on whether language acquisition is innate or is something that happens in the culture. So of course anthropologists then have to come in to say, well, there is some innate part, but if you are not in a community, that part will not develop, and things like that. So I think I wouldn't think so much on particular problems or what is cognition, but it very much depends on who is making this question from his or her own field. I am trying to transmit here to our audience, who are mainly students. I don't want them to be very confused and then say, well, the next step, how could I study cognitive science if I have to do all these things? I would say, well, if it's linguistics, what you like, what is the questions? You have to study linguistics, but then define which is the question you want to get in. But perhaps you may need then approaches from different fields. So as I said, I'm sorry I did not answer your question directly, but hopefully through this wonderful example, of course I'm talking about Noam Chomsky, he not just developed but changed his own field a couple of times. So, but I think it's an extraordinary example.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think there is a way to to get a grip on cognition by dividing it in different themes, thematically dividing it. So we talk, at least I am used to talking of cognitive functions. That is to say, cognition in terms of memory, the study of emotions, perception, action, consciousness, reasoning, and so on. So I think that's a good way, to make it simpler. You're still studying cognition, but you're focusing on a subject or a theme whose complexity is so great that you need the concourse of other disciplines. So, and that is sort of naturally coming. As for myself, I study perception, visual perception, and very soon I realized that as a philosopher, I could really not make sense of many things I was saying or trying to say if I didn't know how the visual system worked. So I had to study the neurobiology of the visual system and also the psychology of vision. So naturally, neurosciences and psychology came to me, as a stand to grab, this object of study, which was perception, visual perception. So that's one part of it, realizing the natural complexity of these cognitive functions in order to approach cognition. Of course, no one will come up and say, I have the theory of cognition, I finally got it, let me tell you the whole picture. I mean, that's ridiculous. But yeah, we have to go piecemeal, approaching the subject, and I think we have definitely made progress, no doubt about that. But the other part is, as I mentioned earlier, attitude. That is to say, we have to open up to other people's vision, other people's viewpoint on these subjects, and that's part of the exercise. And in my experience, I have always seen, in my lab in France and here in Mexico in many settings, I have always seen that there is the phantom of the Babel Tower lurking around us, talking past each other. And we need to definitely recognize that the other researchers and the other person has something to say, which is useful and interesting for my own study. And that's what I call attitude. And I think that's the other part beyond knowledge itself.
Would you like to add something too?
The one point I would perhaps add to that, I really empathize with both your viewpoints on this, would be to bring in the sciences of complexity. Because I think that will help cognitive science. And I think the more interaction, the more interrelationship between complex systems work and cognitive science, or maybe cognitive science embraces complex systems as an additional aspect, which of course involve modeling. And the modeling, the theory experiment relation and the modeling relation, that all is typically the way we make progress in science, regardless of field. So that would be one addition of cognitive sciences.
If cognition comprehends a lot of phenomena, and the attitude that a cognitive scientist or self-proclaimed cognitive scientist takes a problem and then digs into it and just goes around asking for different opinions from different fields or inputs from different fields. Do we have cognitive science just as a collage of different problems that we can attach a label of cognitive to it? It has to do with something with knowledge. And if it has to do something with knowledge, then we can put it in in the bag of tricks of cognition. And it's valid. Would you agree with that description, that we just have a collage of different problems, as long as you have the cognitive attitude and you self-proclaim yourself as a cognitive scientist? Or is there something more profound, more deeper?
I think there's, I mean, if you follow this, the developments of cognitive psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, just to be provocative, I think that the partitioning, the breaking it up into these processes, something you tend to think you have to do in science to break things up. But often in the breaking up, you lose the entity itself, what you're after. And I think, to make a broader point, that in doing that, say with the information processing paradigm, we've actually got further and further away from experience, what the experience actually is. We don't really have a very good language of experience. I mean, if I want a language of experience, I don't go to cognitive psychology. I go to James Joyce, or I go to Samuel Beckett, or I go to any other great writer who can get into the nature of who we are. And I think a lot more could be done to actually relate the language of experience to its underpinnings. I don't know what you think about that. It's a little radical. It's getting near lunchtime. I don't know. I don't know what the...
Would you like
understand what I'm saying?
Atocha, would you
Okay,
say
well,
something?
now let me answer this question or make a general comment from a logic point of view. Some of you know my training actually is as a logician. So when I think of a cognition, and cognition in a very broad sense, I like to think about inferences. What can we infer from some information I have, call it premises or whichever you want, but how to go from some information to some other information. And I think cognition has to do with that. And inferences, well, anything that has to do with any form of action needs some kind of inference. So in this respect, I don't know if Professor Palafox would say, well, is this your way of putting everything into the cognition box? Perhaps. But I think any inquiry, being human or artificial, needs some form of cognition. That's what I would say.
Well, the phantom, there's another phantom lurking around cognitive science also, which is the one you have pointed out. That is the collage, basically a messy picture of putting many things together and then not knowing how they relate to each other, or how they become productive. But I think when you do cognitive science or sciences, the right way, I think you are able, or you should be able, to start from the big picture and then go down to the nuts and bolts of the issue at hand, and then go back to the big picture. So it's kind of dialectical, the way I see. So you start with the big picture, you work on a specific problem, in this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way, and then you restitute that into the big picture, and then you're able to advance, hopefully, the field or science, and that is at the vertical, on the vertical dimension, but then horizontally, then you have the disciplines and the interaction, and that is an art, how to develop that relationship. And that is something that we need to teach our students how to do. It's not something that you should take for granted, you know. In the SEP, la Secretaría de Educación Pública, and in many, many programs at the universities, public universities in Mexico, are promoting interdiscipline and even transdiscipline approaches, you know, to many, many complex objects. So the problem is really how to do it in order not to have become a collage, no? Another thing that I used to say to my students is that we're not todólogos, no? No, I don't know how to translate that into English. Everything logist or something. Because then anything goes, right? And we don't want that either. So it's really an art, but we're working on that. So I'm very happy to see that many people are interested in this, and we need to find the ways in order to not become a collage or a todólogos, you know. But I think there are ways to do it if we really work this vertical relationship and then the horizontal ones too.
Thank you very much. And we'll open the floor to questions if anybody wants to.
By the way, just before you do that, I would just like to reinforce what you're saying. I mean, what you're actually saying is to me, it's what good science is, regardless if it's cognitive science or anything else. That's to say, to you guys, it always starts with some idea, some big idea. And then the trick is, can you get that idea into some specific circumstance that you can truly analyze it and work through the details? And if you can, then you get back to the big idea, but now you've got real clothes. You know, the emperor has clothes. Yeah. So the problem is you could start with big ideas and really not get anywhere because you don't actually take it into a well-defined specific situation where you can actually realize that idea in a well-defined situation. If you do that, then you can get back to the big thing. And then you have something to say.
I have them.
We have several questions.
I actually wanted to make a comment more than a question, and this was in reference to what you mentioned of George Miller and the fact that of course, this definition has been changing, right? But I remember sitting in George Miller's cognitive psychology seminar in 1984, and he actually made a very strong distinction between computer simulations and AI. And he said, you know, we are humans and we walk. AI has wheels. If you want to go from point A to point B, you would design wheels, but that's not who we are. So I think at the very beginning, at least, there was a lot of emphasis of really trying to understand what was possible through simulations. And then I think that's when, years later, in '89, was the first cognitive or Institute of Neuroscience, Cognitive Neuroscience, which really tried to split a little bit and really emphasize that you need to understand the neural correlates to constrain theories, not so much because you want to go to the level of circuits as a very reductionist point, but to see what computations are capable in those circuits and then constrain the theories that we have. So I think there's something that has been lost a little bit, which is that really there was that big step also, at least at the official level in '89, where there was an attempt by people like Miller and Gazzaniga, Posner, Coslin. Those were the people that were in that first Institute of Neuroscience Cognitive, which has then, since then, shaped the career of many, many people, right?
Posner and these people.
He was an engineer. Absolutely, absolutely. But I'm saying they recognize the need to have that neural level that would constrain then the theories that we have.
I have questions over here.
May I quickly just react to Professor Carrasco?
Yes. Go ahead. This is a very rich round table. I don't have to do any questions.
No, it's just that
Please react
phenomenology,
with the
I think,
question.
can also be added to that. And Francisco Varela, with whom I studied, that's what he did. Neural correlates, constraining descriptions, but also experiential descriptions from the phenomenological side. So I think you have one more dimension that can be added to that.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how psychology is part of the cognitive sciences, but it seems to me that we're thinking about a particular type of psychology, mainly in the computational tradition, maybe the behaviorist tradition. But I'm thinking, what about social psychology or even clinical psychology? So this is my way of asking, do we have any sort of obligation to produce theories that could have some sort of impact with people, real people, or can we be, as cognitive sciences, just interested in the theoretical part?
To take that question, or
Well, I just want to say it's a great question. I hope if who is like more of a you are the psychologist,
I
so
will.
yeah. But this
I will say something. In
great
that
question.
respect. Social psychology, I think it's right there. If we want to see a lot of social psychology, what's really important for the cognitive science would be to put it as the study of belief systems. And in one big way, social psychology, the most important part of social psychology, at least the one that has evidence that really supports it, is that context matters. The situation is tremendously important to guide the behavior of human beings. And that's terribly behaviorist. You have to describe the stimuli, but not just in terms of the physical description, but on the meaningfulness of those stimuli. And that makes it terribly cognitive. And I think that the most important part of social psychology, and that's a personal bias, it's when it's cognitive. It's cognitive social psychology, how you interpret the different stimuli that abound in a human society. And for clinical psychology, I think it's becoming more scientific instead of just clinical. And if we didn't have a model of the normal mind, we couldn't have a model of the abnormal mind. And now that we have at least bad models, but at least models last, then we can start producing some evidence of what's really behind several of the clinical syndromes that are of interest. And that's not just recent. I think we can go back to history, back to Kraepelin, and see that, for example, schizophrenia seems to be a clinical syndrome characterized, besides all the florid hallucinations and vivid images and hearing voices, it's abnormal thought and a problem of attention. And Kraepelin said that about more than 100 years ago. It's a problem of attention. And now with probably the advances that we might see very soon in computational psychiatry, we would have more complete models of that.
Yeah, if I can follow up on this, you kind of set up a disjunction, right? It's either we have the theory or we have things that are connected to people's actual experience. But it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to pick. I think it can be both. And I think really following directly in Dr. Palafox's footsteps, one of the key components that's been mentioned, but sort of, I feel like the 20th century has been trying to dance around this concept that we're uncomfortable with, but it's like the idea of meaning, and which is, where one of the things that Dr. Palafox mentioned, in asking what is cognitive science and so on, I think what I would like to add to what's been said, it's that from the perspective I work from understanding the development of cognition, and I don't look into brains, and I don't think at this point in time it would be so helpful. I have a hard time understanding how it would be very helpful. And what we're doing is trying to understand, how do babies interpret the world? How do older kids interpret the world? And what are the basic, what are the first conceptions that one starts with? But so what we're doing there is what we're doing in everyday life, which is to try to interpret each other and try to figure out what we're thinking, how we're, interpreting our environment. Like in a relationship, we get each other wrong all the time, why we said what we said. Well, what's involved there in interpreting the other person, there's a whole field of psychology which dates back to Piaget, Vygotsky, etc. That's what it's all about. It's a science of interpretation. It's trying to make sense of how the other thinks and how that thinking changes over time. And when we're at the level of describing conceptual systems, so there's one of the ways of thinking about this is to think that at least part of our conceptual systems are organized like theories, so that we can actually learn things about cognitive development by studying the history of science and how theories change over time. And at that very high level of description of thought, I don't see much of anything right now in cognitive neuroscience that's very helpful in helping us characterize this. And nonetheless, I take it to be absolutely central to making sense of humans. So it's when we go at that level of meaning, I think, that you don't have to choose between theory and, because, if you take CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's all about understanding people's beliefs and making those explicit, and psychoanalysis too, really, in part, and then changing those changes the life of people, right?
Thank you very much, Matthew. Let's see if we can take another question.
Yeah, sure.
There would be one question, just one more, and we'll round up the round.
I understand the complexity about cognitive sciences or cognitive science, and in fact, I agree with the intention to gather many disciplines in order to approach this really, really complex knowledge, or at least what we assume we could unify as a, let's say, single discipline. But if we were to talk about a single discipline or a unified system, we have to agree maybe, or at least in general terms, that cognition may be a single object of study. And in that sense, most of the cognitive literature says that, or refers to it as information processing or input processing. In that regard, from a neuroscience perspective, I think I have to think about it, or think about the information processing as a dynamic process that is constantly and in real time being modulated by many structures, specifically chemical transmission. If we think about this object, we have to think that lesions, medication, and even the mood of the individual may affect this, the very real-time state of the process of the information processing. So in that regard, are we thinking about this very single object of knowledge, even if it's quite susceptible to real-time deep changes in itself? I mean, distortions, illusions, from pathology, medications. Are we talking in this sense of constant and well-defined object of a study, even if it's constantly changing, even if typical and atypical individuals, because it will affect in every single moment the interpretation of the, I'm not sure if I'm saying correctly, phenomenological approach of the cognitive sciences. I hope it was clear enough. I'm sorry, I'm still an undergraduate.
Would you like to make a comment on?
Well, I'm gonna react to.
I think it was more a long comment than a real question.
But he was asking about what cognition is. Can we talk about cognition now, right? As an object of study, as a coherent whole. That's right. Well, this goes back to what we were talking earlier on, and all I want to say in respect to that is that we don't need to choose, just like Dr. Lecour said. You know, when we're talking about the big picture, you can put information there, you can put experience there, you can put consciousness there, personhood, and so on. So we don't have to choose or to reduce, you know, your study of cognition to this or that or that.
Thank you very much.
Just one very brief point. It has hardly been mentioned, just because I'm only bringing in points like, well, it might be good to bring in complexity, it might be good to bring this and that in, but I don't think cognitive science would have much of a job if it couldn't explain learning. I mean, that's a straight application for the schools and for the educational system. And I think that's a sufficient justification for cognitive science right there, even though cognitive scientists don't often mention it. You know, isn't it strange? But what's not true? Well, relatively speaking, I'm with you. And you go to conferences that's learning. Yeah, but that, as you must agree, that's likely to be a small world. Anyway, I think we can agree that learning is a very important aspect of cognition. Yeah.
Let's wrap up. I don't know if you want to take 30 seconds for final words for the round table. If you want, if not, then we'll just close.
Me? Well, very, very quick. As I was saying at the beginning, but not many people heard me, I was talking to Juan. We had to wait like 20 years, the two of us, to be here, meaning to have like a very big event on the cognitive science here at UNAM. So you can imagine we're very, very happy. That doesn't mean, however, that there has nothing done here at UNAM or in Mexico in general on the cognitive sciences. We've had courses on computational creativity in which we have had students from philosophy of science and from the School of Computer Science as well. And now the one who teaches that class is present here. She was one of the students and so on. And just to finish, also the Faculty of Science, where I come from, originally had a special volume on not on cognition, but they called it on knowledge, where people like Jose Luis Diaz, who will be speaking here later in the week, will be. This is the issue, and I think I will finish here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The good part about being this late, like 20 years late, is that we can not repeat mistakes of the past, and we should avoid being saddled with the categories that have been, discussed in the past, in the United States or in Europe and so on. So by now, I think we, at least in Mexico, as a nascent science, I think we can take the freedom, to choose our own becoming, our own development. And I think that's what we have been doing, in a very quiet fashion, underground, until, in the case of my university, 10 years ago, we finally managed to put out a master's program and now a PhD program. So things are happening, and I'm very excited at the idea of have UNAM now into the ballroom, and a commercial to finish with en español. Para todos nuestros estudiantes pueden visitar www.cienciascognitivas.org y ver lo que estamos haciendo en Morelos, muy cerquita de aquí, y viendo la colaboración con nuestros queridos colegas, creo que podemos hacer algo muy bueno todos juntos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And just a few words. Information is up for grabs. What information is, what it means, is up for grabs. The symbol dynamic issue that I raised is up for grabs. The syntax semantics issue is up for grabs. That is the relationship between information processing as a syntactical process, and all the models are syntactic. How meaning emerges from syntax, that's up for grabs. So there's lots to be done, that's what I would say. Thank you very much.
Cerremos, quiero cerrar esta mesa redonda agradeciendo a los participantes. Thank you very much for your comments. And I want to finish, and I'll say it in Spanish. Mencionando, voy a leer una cita, dije que en español, pero la voy a leer en inglés. Me estoy dando cuenta que la tengo en inglés. I'll read the quote, and it is from Scott Kelso's Dynamic Patterns, and then I'll finish quoting William James. The mistake made by many cognitive scientists is to view symbols, contents as static, symbolic content as static, timeless entities that are independent of their origins. Symbols, like the vortices of the river, may be stable structures or patterns that persist for a long time, but they are not timeless and unchanging. William James, psicólogo, filósofo, decía que la psicología era el estudio de la vida mental, con todo lo que implica el conocimiento del exterior, el conocimiento de lo interior, lo cognitivo, lo emocional, y hablaba de un gran problema que une, creo, a todos los científicos cognitivos, se autoproclamen como tales o tengan ese problema ahí en el horizonte muy cercano, es para todo problema cognitivo hay un problema de quién conoce, un problema de conciencia y de quién está conociendo. Y hablaba precisamente del problema de la cognición como un problema adaptativo. Y simplemente cerraré diciendo que para William James, y es lo que queda reflejado desde los principios hasta esta cita que acabo de leer, el pensamiento es algo continuo y cambiante. Estamos en ello. Muchas gracias por la atención.